So in the previous section, we saw that our template syntax, even though it works quite nicely, can still get quite unwieldy if we're not careful. And we've seen that specifically when we were calculating these sort of percentage increase variables, if you will. So what we want to do now is make that last bit of logic a little bit easier to deal with as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply or store really those values in variables instead. So far, what we've done, if we go back to the original code here, we have we dynamically put all of this calculation inside of the template. That's a really long calculation, even though it's a relatively simple calculation, but it doesn't really enhance the readability of our template. So what we would like to do is we would like to abstract that away and basically just assign whatever is the output of that calculation to a variable. Now there's a bit of an issue here, and that's if we do that, when you assign a value to a variable, it's a one-time affair. So if we don't actually update that calculation on every click or every hover, the actual text will never be dynamic. It will never get updated. Svelte has a solution for that, and that is what we call reactive statements. And what is a reactive statement? It is a statement that will be run, that will basically update itself every time one of its dependencies changes. That means that if, for example, in the calculation of our percentage change, we use this variable called active index, every time active index changes, that particular calculation will be rerun. In Svelte, we can specifically instruct Svelte to interpret something as a reactive statement by basically starting our line with this $: little prefix, and that's an indication that this statement should be reactive. So if we go back to the class material here, if we use this type of statement, so we say $: and then whatever JavaScript we want to run, this will be repeated every time active index changes. Actually, we can have a look at how that works if we go back to Visual Studio Code. And right now we don't have any console logging, so if I hover here, the console stays empty. But if I copy in this statement, so $: and then whatever we want to have run when active index changes, this should execute every time, right? So let's see if that actually happens. So now every time I hover, I should see the index, and I also see when I mouse out, it goes back, or it sets itself to the value reset. So that seems to work. So how do we actually use that little bit of logic to make our code a little bit more readable when it comes to these relative changes or these percentage variables? So to do that, we're going to walk through these 4 steps that you can read here. So first, we're going to refer to our 2 new variables that we're going to create. So refer to 2 new vars. Then we're going to create our own function to calculate percentage increases. We're also going to use, remember this from our previous section, the function that's called math.round, which is a built-in function in JavaScript, and you can read the documentation if you follow this link, to actually round the percentages to a pretty number. So it's a little bit more readable than that, whatever we currently have with lots of digits after the decimal indicator. And then finally, we're going to use function to reactively update the 2 percentage variables. All right, so let's see how that works in practice. First things first, I'm going to go to my template here, and I'm going to replace this entire calculation, there we go, with just the name of our new variable. So I'm going to call that relative change previous decade, and then we're going to do that here too. But I'm not going to call this previous decade, I'm going to call it first decade. Okay, and you can again see the crinkly lines indicating, oh, those variables actually do not exist yet. So let's get that out of the way as well. So just as we define active index here, we can also say let relative change previous decade, and we can say let relative change first decade. So that just defines those variables, but that doesn't actually store any value in them yet. That can come later, but we should see now when we hover, there we go. You should see, oh, that's annoying. Let me see if we can make this a bit. I'll just zoom out a little bit so that we should be able to see it. There we go. So now you see that instead of the percentages, it just says undefined. That's because we haven't actually stored any useful value in those variables. All right, so let's actually do that. To do that, first we need to create a new function to calculate a little bit more easily our relative increase. So I'm going to create a new function, and I'm going to call it, how do we call it? Relative change. And to calculate relative change, we need to know the old value and the new value, which are the two arguments to our function. And we are going to use those two arguments to calculate first a change. So that is basically new value minus old value. So if we have increased from 1 million to 3 million, the change is 2 million. And then we can calculate that relative as a percentage. So that is the change divided by the old value. And then remember, a function can return something too. So I'm going to return, and normally I would just return the percentage, but we know that those percentages have lots of digits. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to encapsulate this all in this function called math.round. And what that will do is it will nicely round the percentage first, and then that's what it will return. All right, so just to go back to my overview here, so what we've done is we have created two new variables. We've also created our own function to calculate percentage increases. We haven't actually used it yet. We don't even know if it works or if there's errors in it, but we'll find out soon. And then we have used math.round as well, supposedly. We'll see how it works. Now, finally, we have to use this function to reactively update these two percentage variables. So I am going to type $:, because I know I want to reactively update something, so I know that I need to use these the $sign to tell Svelte to actually do that. And then what I want to do is I want to use this relative change function, and the output of that, depending on which old and new value I'm using, I want to use the output of that to basically store into these variables right now, relative change previous decade and relative change first decade, that are currently undefined. Now, there's a little bit of a trick when you want to do multiple things inside of the same kind of reactive block. Normally, you have to type everything on one line, but I can also type curly braces, and then that allows me to type over multiple lines, and then everything within the curly braces, so everything within the first opening curly brace and then the closing curly brace will be part of that same reactive block. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign to relative change previous decade the outcome of the relative change function, and that needs old value and new value. So the old value will be data active index -1, and then specifically the population and the, oh, I'm just going to try and copy this, and because we need a second argument, namely for the new value, and that's of course the current decade, so then we do not use the -1. So this, hopefully, so we have a white screen, and we have this error here, cannot read property population of undefined. What's happening here? Well, because active index originally is set to this empty string, and we also reset it with this reset word, that's not actually a valid index number. So if you want to access the 7th or the 10th value in an array, you can do that. But if you want to access the reset value in an array, that doesn't compute. So we can only do this if there's an actual number stored in active index. So we need to add a bit of a safeguard here, and we can do that by basically saying if active index is larger than 0, then calculate all those percentages. If it's 0 or anything else, there's no use in actually calculating these percentages. So I'm going to encapsulate that all in this if statement. So this line 113 here will never run if the active index isn't larger than 0. So if it isn't 1, or 2, or 3. So now I save, my chart is back here, and then when I hover over, we see here that it's showing something, but it's not actually showing what we would expect to see, because it is always 0% increase. And that is because we have a mistake in our function definition here, because we calculate the actual change, new value minus old value, that's correct. But then we divide that by old value. But if we want to have the change in percentages, we have to, of course, multiply it by 100. Otherwise, it will be a very small number and round it down to 0. So let's see. There we go. So now you see we have nicely round percentages everywhere. But of course, that second percentage is still undefined, and that's because we have only updated the relative change for the previous decade. So I'm just going to copy this to the second line as well, and I'm going to replace relative change previous decade to relative change first decade. And then, of course, the old value, the first argument to the function, will not be active index -0 anymore, but will just be 0, because that is the very first decade, namely 1750. I'm going to save that, and then hopefully when I hover, yeah, there you go. So now our percentages are nicely rounded and both of them are displayed. I'm also going to just remove this console log because we don't actually need that anymore. Clean up a little bit. All right, that looks all good. So just to make sure we haven't forgotten anything, yeah, so this was our last step, to use that function, that relative change function, to reactively update these two percentage variables. And remember, the big advantage of that is that now we don't have that really long calculation inside of our template syntax, and the logic of what is happening is much easier to read. So we can tick this last one off the list as well.